marketing has become more a matter of math. And you see this in very growth marketing focused roles. The qualifications around analytics have really gone through the roof in a lot of marketing leadership positions.
Hello and welcome to the Marketing Times Analytics podcast. I'm your host, Alex Safranis, and today we're on with Doug Busk. Doug, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Doug Busk, and I'm currently a principal at Arvo Advisory, and I'm a consultant who focuses on marketing transformation.
Awesome. Yeah, so give us a little overview of your career and how you ended up in that role.
Before I jump in, first, thank you for the invitation. I'm excited to be here. This is a topic of big focus for me in my professional life, and it's an honor to talk to a colleague, and all of your listeners hopefully will gain from the conversation. How did I get here? It's been an interesting journey. I have been forever at the intersection in the art of and science of marketing. That has taken a couple of forms since I graduated from college in the 90s, starting really with the original dot-com revolution and then on into mobile, where I spent over a decade of my time helping build out effectively the infrastructure and the systems that created the mobile application and mobile marketing revolution. I spent enough time in that space that I remember talking about mobile as the quote unquote fourth screen, which seems very quaint and somewhat silly now that it's the primary screen people see as the last one before they go to sleep and the first one when they wake up, for better or worse. And then that has led me on to other chapters in my career around social media and content marketing generally. These have taken a couple of forms in titles, sometimes communication, sometimes marketing, but the story remains the same. How do we find our audiences? How do we connect with them where they spend their time? And how do we tell stories that are worth them reading, sharing, and engaging with?
That makes sense. So, yeah, mobile is such an important part of our lives. I'm curious, this is more to do with maybe the experience, but will we be using cell phones in their current form in 5 or 10 years? Do you see any change to the way that mobile is defined?
It's an interesting way of looking at it. The interface, I think, is less important today than the method, the way in which we're engaging with it. We've moved from, and Chris Hayes' recent book, The Siren's Cry, talks a lot about this. We've moved from the information age to the attention age. So, where our attention is matters more than what has our attention, meaning the physical thing that has our attention. We start to get into spaces that are much more virtual. You can look at gaming, which has frankly been in the virtual world with avatars and otherwise much longer than other spaces in our lives. Of course, there's the Quest from Meta, the Vision Pro from Apple, which extend that experience in an even different way. In net answer to your question, I think the method of the screen we're looking at will adjust inevitably at some point from a candy bar style slab computer we carry in our pockets and our bags to some other modality. But I don't know if that will be a seamless flip. Put differently, we don't move from standard four-wheel cars to hover cars overnight. It's not the Back to the Future scene where suddenly all the old cars we had are retrofitted to go into the skies. So similarly, we will continue to have smartphones in some way, shape, or form for a while, but they will sit among all sorts of other interfaces.
So, moving towards the business side, I see in Google Analytics, they always have this report that's how much traffic is from desktop versus mobile, but it's always been somewhat unclear to me on what the next action is. So, how should a business view their messaging on mobile as separate from their messaging on desktop? What are the differences in how a company would use the two, I guess, distribution methods?
I tend to look most at the metrics that tell me whether or not the story I'm putting out there for myself or my brand is resulting in any sort of real organic delight, understanding, or engagement by the target audience. So the mode, that interface, as I mentioned, matters a lot less from that perspective than other metrics I might see. Organic engagement, deduplicated and as real as I can possibly get it. Did they comment in a real way? Did they share it with others? This is all dependent on what that platform is going to tell you if we're talking about it in social media terms. If we're looking at streaming, they have their version of it, which is watch time, beginning to end. Are they listening on 2x or 3x on a podcast? All of those metrics are indicators of deeper engagement than the sort of baseline that I might see from, okay, it was a desktop or a mobile experience. That can tell you certain things, but it's not nearly as important as any sort of engagement related metric as far as the performance of the stories you're telling.
Got it. And would you say that B2B is more fit for a desktop experience when you're communicating the value of your business and different content, and maybe B2C is better for a mobile experience? Or is there really no difference because of that, the fact that they're somewhat interchangeable and it's more about what the content is?
Yeah, I think as marketers, we put a lot more weight into whether it's B2B or B2C than any real human does. We have professional and personal lives, and for most of us, they intersect rather seamlessly. You might be a B2B buyer, say in the supply chain space, and you've got a free 20 minutes during your kid's soccer game, and you might pull out your phone during those 20 minutes and zero in on an analyst report in your space. Does it matter more that it occurred in that time and place and through that device than it does that you actually bothered to read that analyst report? I would say it's how long you spent on the analyst report, and did you share it? Is it reflective of, does it gratify your perspective on the business, or does it challenge your challenge in the business? I tend to strip away whether or not it's a B2B or a B2C message and really get at, is the audience engaging in a real way? And if there is a call to action, are they taking up that action? That is, I think, one differentiator that I see in the marketing spaces, specifically in marketing roles or the way in which teams hire. When you look at direct to consumer plays, somebody is trying to get you to buy a shoe or a pair of socks or a particular top or whatever it might be, the call to action is clear, right? And so the funnel really does zero in on, did they purchase? Did they subscribe? So I do think there's a difference in the type of content you might be sharing, but at the end of the day, it's just another form of engagement to me. A purchase is in many ways the ultimate engagement, but not the only one, certainly.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so, while you're looking at different types of engagement, are you an advocate for multi touch attribution models? Or what types of attribution do you recommend businesses?
Yeah, I think again, I do look at multi-touch attribution models, but I tend to make sure that I'm customizing that consideration for that call to action or the end point. The end point might be brand reputation, as it was when I was working on the global communications side at the Coca-Cola company. We were focused on making sure that people not only liked the Coca-Cola brand, but understood where the company was coming from, understood the humans and the leaders vision that was behind it that formed the products that they might purchase at a 7-Eleven or a Kroger or a Walmart. So in that case, the points I looked at were really more about understanding of what the company was doing, which could be reflective in how they were reading and sharing our content. So there is another end of that horizon, however, in that marketers can drown in multiple data points. So I try to work hard with my clients and my teams when I'm in a full-time capacity to zero in on the 3 to 4 metrics that matter. A simplistic way of looking at that is, what is reported out to the board? What does the board track? When they pull up their email, what is the one report they are going to open every single time? That's usually going to tell you 1 or 2 metrics you should be focused on as a marketer or communicator. And then if you want to add others that are supplementary along that are indicative of the journey there to whatever that moment is, to whatever that call to action is, if you have a discrete one, fine. But you want to make sure that what you're doing can be explained in an elevator chat to somebody who's on the board.
That makes a lot of sense. So, I'm curious, just to clarify, being in communications versus being in marketing, what are some of the differences in the scope?
Budget. That's the easiest answer in a lot of environments. That's an insider, somewhat cynical joke among communicators and marketers. And it is, to a certain degree, a reality. What is also a reality, I find, however, is the narrative has shifted somewhat between those departments. That's the clearest difference I've seen in my professional arc is marketing when I first got into When I first got into the working world after college, marketing really owned the story of the brand or the company or the brands. And communications was effectively PR. So it was media relations, a little bit around corporate reputation, but largely limited to financial careers, sometimes investor relations, and of course, public affairs on the governmental lobbying side. What has shifted as marketing has become more a matter of math. And you see this in very growth marketing focused roles. The qualifications around analytics have really gone through the roof in a lot of marketing leadership positions. Those roles have, in many ways, required lesser focus on the story of the company. And so that narrative had to land somewhere. So the biggest change I've seen over the last 10, 15 years is that it's now often the communicators that are the keeper of the brand, maybe not the brand playbook per se, but what is the story we're trying to tell? What is the narrative we're trying to tell to our buyers, our stakeholders, reporters, whether they're fans or critics, or oftentimes they can be both, as opposed to marketing, which might be looking more directly at all of those data points to your prior question that lead to the action marketing is looking for. So that's been the biggest change over that span of time is that communications teams have, I find, a lot more ownership over the story that the brand or the company is trying to tell than they used to.
That makes a lot of sense. And I totally agree. Marketing is rapidly becoming more scientific, and there's less and less that can be explained by art, mostly in the upper funnel, and trying to understand how that awareness funnels into down funnel activity. And that's the probably the trickiest piece right now to draw a connection between, but it's moving further away from what's the story that we want to tell and how do we really engage with people. And I think it's because there's only so much that the existing team can do. People have a limited scope, and it's so important to make sure the budget is being spent properly that it leaves less time for that more creative side of what marketing used to own more of, per your point.
Yeah, there's only so many channel reports a marketing team and their partners, agency or freelancer, can churn out in a day. There's only so much time they can spend analyzing to find the actionable information in that data, which is why I try to focus in on the 3 to 4 metrics that matter, not the 10 or 15 data points we can possibly get, and be willing to set those as a standard and at least for a quarter or over a year, monitor against that as a measure of success rather than simply move the goalposts around. That's hard to do when the platforms, particularly on the social media side and the creator side, are, I think it's safe to say, continuously evolving, would be the kind way of putting it, if not going through wholesale changes of their own, like Twitter and X, as an example.
Yeah. So let's say a company advertises to different audiences. Are you thinking about how do we communicate to each audience differently? Or are you structuring an overarching narrative for what the company brings to the market?
This is most applicable. Your question, I think, is most applicable to House of Brands model, which would be analogous to, in my experience, Coca-Cola or Google. I think it's important to have an overarching purpose for the company. So I do believe there remains a need for the overarching story of the company. What does everything from an Apple say to its consumers? What is the commitment it's making to its consumers? Which Apple might tell you right now that's ease of use, incredible power in all our devices, but also privacy and some security elements. And that, in some way, shape, or form, those attributes of that overarching or umbrella narrative would then filter down, hopefully, to each one of their devices. So my AirPods will work with the MacBook Air when I'm jumping on this call, and I don't have to worry about whether or not that's going to be the case. That's an attribute that I think comes from Cupertino, from the primary brand itself. So I do think it's important that these brands spend time on is centering on an overall brand, especially in a realm of, I think, tremendous brand identity shift. There are multiple companies and brands that I buy from that are, in fact, owned by two or three major private equity funds or funds behind them, right? And so understanding that the shoes you buy may not necessarily be operated by a bigger entity can be a little alienating, for a consumer. What does it really mean? I thought I knew this brand. It's the store I used to go to when it was in a mall, and now it's only sold online and it's bought by a larger brand behind it. So I think there's an opportunity with those brands that aren't simply a holding company or an entity behind them to make an omnibus commitment that, when you think about it, if done right, does two things. It carries a lot of weight for the brand. So for those smaller brands within it, Apple being a great example of that. Ease of use expresses through everything Apple tries to sell and tries to get out there. It's technology that's approachable. It's technology that it won't take a lot to understand and set up. That does tremendous good for each one of the individual products it sells. However, it's not like Apple didn't go through it to get there. Apple has had a lot of turns and continues to have a lot of turns. Number one. Number two, so it's not easily earned. Number two, like everything in life, it has to be maintained. So that's not a small level of commitment on behalf of the brand that does it. It's a big ask and it has to be continuously messaged.
Yeah. How does a company arrive at a good message? Because Apple, for example, has had many different taglines. I remember Think Different was a really big one, which could be thought of as that we're innovative and almost the early version of that
Mhm.
umbrella communication theme. So, how do you figure that out for a company if they don't have one?
First of all, they're fantastic and awesome opportunities for a marketer. I love those challenges. When you're looking at a brand that's in the midst of a reboot or a reset, I like to call it a recentering on its core mission. It can be incredibly empowering for both the brand from a sales standpoint and from a retention and employee communications and recruitment standpoint. The Think Different campaign is a good one to look at because for me, it's personal. I grew up and really learned to get into technology as a marketer because of Apple. And when Think Different was launched, I happened to be living in San Francisco. I remember walking downtown and I saw one of the first multi-story billboards of, in that case, a black and white photo of Einstein and just the Think Different in the classic font. And that expressed so much to me as a longtime Apple fan. I felt Apple was coming back to a place that rewarded the artists, the thinkers. It's everything. I'm not going to recite the entire commercial, though sadly I probably could. And that's how memorable it was. It was both a ambitious regrounding of the company and what they stood for. They were making a big commitment in doing that, but it was also a signal to their audience that in many ways they were returning to their core. So when a brand does that, I think it's important to have that conversation internally. What are we really about? And are we prepared to follow through on this commitment? Think Different wouldn't have been nearly as powerful if what came after it wasn't the succession of devices that occurred, starting with the iMac and then the iPod and the iPhone, and the rest is history. So they had to back that up with a significant number of product announcements that were not low risk. And I'm sure Steve Jobs and other leaders there had to go to the board and make that commitment and effectively ask their shareholders to be along with them for the ride.
So, when you say it's a challenge, how what's the thought process that the marketers or communications folks would go through to figure out what defines the brand?
There's a number of ways, there's a number of frameworks that you could apply to it. The one I prefer is the traditional hero's journey. This is the story arc that has been set since effectively ancient times, starting with the Greeks, that we need to center this in a character. What is the character of the company? What is the journey they go on? What is the journey our customers go on? What is the challenge and the drama they face? And what is the, which effectively can be communicated as the problem? What is the problem you're dealing with? And how are we, it, us, the solution? That story, once you condense it down to a tagline that cuts through, that differentiates, that really zeroes in, just because we're talking about it. Think different, not only from grammatical perspective, was striking and yes, and correct, but it was a way of reconnecting with Apple fans, people mainly who had abandoned the platform because they felt that they had to go to a PC, they had to be in a Microsoft Windows environment. Maybe they were because of work, maybe they felt like they couldn't rely on Apple equipment in the way they did before, but they always felt they did. They think different, they operate a little differently. That was the subset of evangelists that Apple wanted to rekindle. When brands are facing that moment, it's an opportunity to define that journey anew. And they may be surprised. I find sometimes leaders of companies are surprised with things they think are simplistic or maybe forgotten about their brand are in fact what their core consumers and audiences appreciate about them. Other times it's a little bit harder, and you have to talk about how are we going to back up this commitment we've decided to make. So I do come back to a traditional sort of Greek storytelling arc of the hero's journey and try to put the brand and its customers at the center of that journey.
And you're thinking about the evangelists more so than maybe the average customer down the line after mass adoption. Yeah, that's really interesting. And you're
I think in the case,
aligned.
I
Yeah.
I don't know if that's just to clarify on that for a moment. I think that when you're in a situation that Apple was in the 90s, that was that was an optimal path to go with, to start with the evangelists. There are gradations of evangelism. Some of it is very daily. These are all buying decisions that can be daily. When you're at a CPG like Coca-Cola, it's not as frequent of purchase and therefore decision making process as, say, a MacBook. But nevertheless, you're making a decision. So, in a way, every buying decision makes an evangelist out of the customer, out of the consumer. Or I should say, there's an opportunity for evangelism. And I continue to be impressed with the way in which marketers find new ways to kindle evangelism in spaces that were presumed boring or bland. The water space, for example, with what's the brand I'm forgetting? It's the
Liquid Death.
tall Liquid Death. Brilliant example of that. Everyone thinks bottled water is bottled water. Seltzer is seltzer. Who really cares? There's interchangeable, might be the perspective. The marketers behind Liquid Death said, no, actually, you can create evangelists out of this and therefore drive a premium product. So I think your ideal state, particularly as a consumer brand, and this is where we do get to some of the differences between consumer and business buyers, but I think the case remains the same even in B2B spaces. A sense of evangelism, a sense of connection is going to drive your attention to that brand, no matter what brand space it occupies.
Okay. Yeah. And turning over to the analytics side, how do you know it's working? Because maybe the people at the company like it, but they're a little bit biased and they're not coming at it from the perspective of somebody who might not be too familiar or might be coming at it from a different perspective, not knowing the inner workings of the company. So, how do you actually know that it's working?
This is where we return to the metrics that matter that I mentioned before. You want to pick three or four and be honest with yourself. Do not change those metrics. And once the campaign is up and rolling, make sure you're measuring consistently against those. You're testing theories. You're testing theories of interest, you're testing theories of engagement all along the funnel to purchase, to subscription, to if you're looking at things like reputation, you might be looking at engagement or sharing or readers, post reader surveys and the like. But whatever metrics that matter you've selected, make sure you're honest with yourself and returning to those to make sure that the campaign you've launched is making a difference.
Okay. And what are some examples? Are you looking at, I guess surveys would be separate, but there's also ways to survey representative samples of people, which might be part of the equation. But I'm curious, what actual metrics do you measure? Is it organic activity and engagement? What would you recommend that a business starts with? And then what's like the ideal?
Yeah, the funnel is slightly different depending on can be is going to be different based on the segment of the product we're looking at. But if we're looking at, say, a clothing line or a direct to consumer line, I might start at top of funnel of are they following a creator I've partnered with? Have they engaged with the creator when they are talking about our products? Or if we're a sponsor, how much engagement are we getting around the sponsored series of content, and then move down the funnel into, okay, did we convert that into a discount, and have we converted that into an email sign up, and then that moves more into what you might see from Shopify tools or other commerce tools on the ability to get all the way to sell through. Is often lost in journeys like that is post sale. So, what is the follow-up on satisfaction with the product, the returns level? Why are returns happening if they're happening? Making sure to monitor organic engagement on in the purchase experience. So, if there's a comments environment or there's a feedback loop that we're not monitoring, these can sometimes be disconnected and gems of metrics that tell us a lot about not only the product, but the entire sales cycle that leads up to it. So, I try not to leave the post-sale opportunity on its own. That can sometimes be handed off to a totally different team. It might be the commerce team in some environments, it might be community management. So those feedback loops, I think, can be as telling, if not more telling, than the actual pre-sale loop. These are people, after all, who've actually bought your product and are using your product. So that's just one example into D2C consumer environment. That would be different, obviously, for auto. That would be different for a fast-moving product type like Coca-Cola, like drinks and beverages. And even within beverages, there's a different determination cycle for non-alcoholic versus alcoholic. There are similarities in those experiences, but obviously the feedback route, like the complaint route for a fast-moving product that's sold at $2 from a Wawa, is going to be quite a bit different from somebody saying, I didn't really like this $200 pair of shoes.
Ho- I'm getting the sense that you're looking at overall sort of sales health, funnel health, and correlating that with messaging. But how do you determine the impact of the messaging versus, let's say, the media placement or the sales motion? How do you determine the unique impact of the communications?
Sure, there are signals throughout the flow. So there's, as I mentioned, there's engagement and sharing on content, whether it's owned, earned, or sponsored. There's open rate on emails. There's comments and mentions that are all attributes of what should be an overall messaging success formula. And that sometimes is often more powerful for the marketers or the communicators that are operating the campaigns than it is leadership. Leadership is generally going to give you one or two metrics that truly matter for the overall health of the company, which is typically some form of sell through, right? I like to look at all of the touch points that are available to a campaign and work with the team. If I'm on the communication side, I want to make sure to work with the marketing side to coalesce around three or four that matter the most. And if we have an overall engagement or brand health metric we can unify around, let's centralize around that so we don't have to constantly re explain what every touch point means to each player inside the company, not to mention agency as well. This is a particular point that I think gets lost for a lot of marketers and communicators is those of us internally, if I happen to be inside the company, are operating off of a different set of metrics than our agency partners are. And this can lead to wildly different perceptions of success. So I think it's essential to set a standard and sometimes say, we follow this standard. So we will be applying our standard of engagement, of heat mapping, of click through, and you have to abide by that and use that solution as opposed to your own definition or solution to monitor the same or what you think is the same.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm curious, what happens if a brand doesn't resonate or the communication that was decided upon is just not is it possible for a poor communication strategy to harm the brand, or can that be made up for with more media placement and just a great product? What is the relative impact of a good versus a bad communication strategy on the total product?
It- Certainly. And in fact, some of the most instructive communications lessons are from how a company, how a brand makes up for a mistake, makes up for just a boneheaded move. This does happen. We're human. There's the wrong message on the wrong day to the wrong audience with the wrong guess as to success. And brands take risks sometimes to really push that window of learning. So, in my experience, some of those fails have been the most illustrative leadership lessons around. Coca-Cola, they still talk about what happened with New Coke, that within a matter of around 40 days, the company realized it made a major mistake in pushing out a new version of Coke, and it returned with Coke Classic, and Coke Classic quickly became dominant again. There are marketing and communications textbooks written about companies and how they've managed for either mistakes they knew or crises that they couldn't have predicted. And that in fact is a key pillar for any communication strategy: is how are you recognizing the mistake made or simply the directional error in what your messaging is doing, and how do you tune that? And I think this is that dexterity, that agility is all that more important in today's world. We're living in an enormous time of change on any number of strata, demographically, institutionally. The faith in institutions, government, big brands are changing at a faster rate than they have for generations. So I think it's now more important than ever. You need to have that agility and recognize what the data is telling you. That's why that actionable data and only a few metrics that matter surface that fast enough for you to recognize it and make a change. And then sometimes it takes courage to acknowledge that, to bring that back to leadership and say, okay, this was the bet we placed. It doesn't seem to be working out. And we need to either, we recommend adjusting or a wholesale change. And that's key in the attention economy because attention can refocus on that super fast.
I'm assuming you have some experience with the sort of news cycle, or at least how the media responds to different communications. And I've seen different strategies play out. There's people who will go right out and apologize, there's people who won't say anything. And then there's the occasional sort of infamous celebrity that doubles down and does something even crazier. So when there is a mistake or something that is being criticized for a company or even an individual, how do you make a decision on what the next step is? What kind of person or company should go the sort of ignoring it route? Which company acknowledges and changes? And then which company just keeps going with what they're doing?
I go back to whether or not there's gradations to events, right? So the data should be able to tell you whether this is a major or minor event and or in between, and then tune your reaction accordingly. I want to go back to the framing you provided with news cycle. I don't think there's so much a news cycle as simply an information stream. The attention moves so quickly. It is no longer, okay, we're going to wait until the nightly news comes out and then hopefully our story will get out there. That just is not the world we're in. We live in a 24/7 nonstop attention economy. And that has made modulating how and when you respond, and why the option you mentioned of either doubling down or ignoring it can be a viable choice for some marketing and communications teams. How I would determine whether you react and to what level you react and the path to which you react is understanding again what the data is actually telling you, what is actionable, the dialogue that is occurring around the event, the incident, the issue, and then sizing that against what your response might be and when you can possibly make it. So there are lots of conversations around a lot of big global brands. And it's very important to understand in those moments how big the conversation is, how directly does it connect or not with your brand commitment, with what you've put out there as the commitment the company makes in either a house of brands mode, which would be the omnibus overarching commitment, or on an individual brand basis, and how long the conversation is going to occur. That's one page. And then on the next page, considering the attributes or the consequences of the way in which you respond. So, a brand like Coca Cola is mentioned just about every second around the world multiple times. So, for the company to jump into any one dialogue, it has to have a relatively high bar, that it is a topic that will take direct issue with the commitment that the company makes with those brand attributes and will be a lasting conversation. And finally, one that's organic. The reality is, however they're perpetuated, however they're created, there are a ton of bots and illegitimate artificial activity out there. That I think is an important filter through which to consider how you might respond. If this is something that's being artificially accelerated, simply recognize that and incorporate that into your response possibilities.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Do you see this issue of bots extending like into the future, or do you think that the market will solve for that with time as things like premium tiers of all these social media apps are starting to come out where you are verified? How do you see the bot issue working out in the future?
I don't see it going away. And right now, I think we're entering an entirely new era where bots are talking to bots. So there are studies out there indicating that 25 to 30% of the written content on networks like LinkedIn are already bot created. There was a recent event with Meta where, while these avatars have been up for a while, they were AI created, quote unquote, people, users that you could engage with. And even though it was Meta, if memory serves, came back and said, no, this was an experiment and they had been out there for some time before it happened to get the attention of somebody who had a big following and engaged with them. So we're entering an entirely new era of challenges around identifying organic and real content. I don't think the verification systems, at least in the way in which I've seen them rolled out, are providing a lot of protection around that, at least not to the point that as an advisor to brands, I could say you could lean on that, that you could lean on just the verification system. And the flip side is also true. A lot of what made discourse and dialogue and the open web enticing is that you could do so with some level of anonymity that was under your control as an individual user. So there are First Amendment components of this, at least in the US, that we need to incorporate into this conversation. From a marketer standpoint, I think it's essential that we continue to push for tools that identify true human engagement as much as we can, that deduplicate the same comment that is delivered hundreds of thousands of times from users that aren't simply doing a copy paste, that may in fact not be real users. Because if you don't apply those filters, and there's a lot of solutions out there, some of and others that are coming out that are getting better and better at this. It will continue to be a race, but if you don't do that, if you don't incorporate that into your understanding, you are in a position of potentially overreacting, underreacting, or conducting what could be a market changing event, if you think about it. So, a company's reputation can be absolutely impacted by a ton of dialogue on social. And if it's artificial, I think it's really important to understand it's artificial and incorporate that into your planning. Sadly, I don't think there's an immediate response. I am seeing some tools out there that are doing a better job of identifying that, but I don't think there's a universal solve yet.
Yeah, and you mentioned something that's really hot right now, the AI and AI generated content, even not even as a bot, but just as a marketer and feeding a prompt into AI, grabbing it, editing it a little bit, and posting it. What's your perspective on that? Do you advocate for that? Do you think it's a good sounding board? How do you recommend communications professionals utilize AI?
First of all, it's a tremendous tool for marketers and communicators. I think it's important we understand, just as I tried to be ahead of or on top of the mobile revolution and tried to get an understanding of what was happening with social media engagement. AI is simply another tool in our that we can leverage, and I think it's important to understand the overarching capability, to understand what LLMs are about, to understand the difference between generative and chat and all the different forms that the agents can take. There's in their current form, as is leveraged by most communicators and marketers I engage with on a daily basis, there's a lot of excitement and a lot of viability to particularly how ChatGPT and others can be daily brainstorming or working partners. I like to call them the ultimate first draft and pretty good second draft editors. The ability to go into any one of the chat environments and have an engaging conversation with, for example, with a Gemini or with a ChatGPT or Perplexity or a Claude is powerful. So too is understanding the limits and the event horizon, if you will, of those tools. I had a moment yesterday with a very simple political fact that I had to correct Chat GPT on. And of course, in a very human way, it came back, oh, you know what? You're right. My bad. That election is actually 2 years away from there. So understand what the tools can do for you as a marketer, understand their limits. When we look at pure creativity, my expectation for my own work is what I would ask of anybody I was working with, and what I would inform any of my clients is exactly that. This is what they're good for today, but understand you have to continue to have a skeptical eye, that these are tools still very much in nascent growing phases. And it's going to take a while to really understand the big iron application of them. So I know there's a tremendous amount of interest in it, and I know it's driving all sorts of market movers. I get that. But as a communicator, especially one who's contracting through a group of people like Arvo or contracting on my own, I have to stand by my work, which means if I'm going to use one of those tools, you can bet I understand what the tool is doing, and I understand that it might make mistakes.
Yeah, that's really interesting. In your opinion, the best communication messaging, will that always come from people because of our innate understanding of what connects? Or do you think AI will be able to surpass that innate human creative ability at one point and create even more compelling messages?
I'm a big fan of science fiction and particularly dystopian sci-fi. I grew up with movies like Escape from New York and later fell in love with visions like Blade Runner, where this and in so many other places as humans and storytellers, we've wrestled with this. When is a machine that is made by humans going to exceed the humanity of the humans that made it? And as a communicator, I prize in my work and in the work that my clients do and employers do authenticity. How are we getting to the authentic message that connects? I also look at comedy because a funny joke is instinctive, at least if it's funny to you. And you can't stop yourself from laughing at it. It's just a human. It comes from a connection with the joke or the joke teller, the person who's saying it, that is so instant somewhere in your brain. You laugh. You can't control it. It's just something that is that authentic connection. Right now, I think where most of the agents are, at least that I've come in contact with, are better at providing templates and models and frameworks than they are borrowing from other artist creations as frameworks, which is a whole other podcast we could do about the viability of that or the legitimacy of that. I don't think they're quite at the point of creating a fully authentic voice. There are some agents that can seem friendly. There are some chat experiences that seem downright human. I don't know if they've reached anything close to what I would call human authenticity. Will we get there? And how soon we get there is for people who are deeper into the space than I am. And I work with some of those. and there's a ton of possibilities. There's a little bit of peril as well. So right now, I think it's important again for marketers and communicators to understand the opportunity of AI as a tool, and also the perils that might be there, or more importantly, the watchouts of, okay, this is what a hallucination looks like. This is an indication of something in the unreal. There's been several headlines just in the last week about AI techniques and tools being used for spoofing and getting people to give up personal information. That's very real. And that gives you a sense of the perils that are there. And it's an area that I think we should certainly watch out for. But again, this all falls into the category of opportunity and perils at the same time.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Wow. Yeah, there's a lot to think about. I want to thank you, Doug, for joining the podcast and sharing your thoughts. And this has been one of my favorite episodes ever. Very unique. You would
Oh,
think,
thank you.
talking to so many marketers, you'd think we would cover this, but a lot of it is brand new to the podcast. So thank you again for joining.
I'm honored by the invitation and I'm deeply complimented by what you just said. So thank you so much. And I hope the listeners enjoy it as much as I did.
Awesome. Thanks again. And thanks everyone for listening. We'll talk to you soon.